Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. The Outdoor Adventure Series celebrates individuals and families, businesses, and organizations that seek out and promote the exploration, stewardship, conservation, and access and enjoyment of the great outdoors. Our guest today on the Outdoor Adventure Series is William Bradley. Brad is a retired co-founder of NIC, a technology solutions company. He is the owner and president of Little Osage Ranch and the president and co-founder of FarmTender, LLC. Now, I met Brad at the Outdoor Writers Association of America, our conference in Casper, Wyoming this past May. Brad sat on a panel discussion where we spoke about the topic of regenerative agriculture and ecosystem and wildlife conservation. And I thought, that's a really interesting topic. And so Brad was gracious enough to accept my invitation to appear on the podcast. And so, Brad, welcome.
Well, here we are, aren't we?
And so here we are. Fantastic. Now, I have to ask, where are you located?
I'm in the Kansas City area.
Okay. I think I've been to Kansas City once, and I know it's known for a lot of things besides baseball and football.
Barbecue.
Barbecue.
We were just named one of the 16 host cities for the 2026 World Cup.
Oh, wow.
So we have a surprisingly large and vibrant soccer fan community here.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. And so we met at the OWAA's conference in Casper. And before we get into that, and I'd love to hear about the invitation, the why, but could you share a little bit about your background for our listeners?
Certainly. I grew up on a farm south of Lawrence, Kansas, which is the home of the University of Kansas, and did all the normal farm things. We had cattle, hogs, row crops, grain crops, and lots of hay. So we did all of that, soybeans. So throughout my high school years, then ended up attending the University of Kansas, swearing I would never be a farmer. Got out of law school and had married a girl from Western Kansas. So we moved about halfway across the state to be closer to her family. And I had 9 very interesting and rewarding years of practice in a town of about 38,000 people that served a large trade area of maybe a couple 100,000 people. And then I was persuaded to move to Wichita, Kansas, and practiced there for 6 years with a business boutique firm, slightly larger. This was the 1980s into the early 90s, and there was a savings and loan crisis was going on. There was a farm crisis going on, lots and lots of farm bankruptcies, resolution trust corporation, and so forth. So I did a lot of trial work, and I also did a lot of commercial lending work, which ended up being a lot of bankruptcy work. So I got very deeply involved in bankruptcy law, but in my spare time, I had gotten an idea for a business. And so I worked on that for several years, and it took 6 years to get it really going. And here in Kansas, and then the end of about 7 years, I left law practice to join that business.
Okay.
And I was with them for 21 years. We grew from a very small operation in one state to have a presence in 35 states, I think, and a few federal agencies. So if you think of your state website, let me use Kansas as an example, kansas.gov. We built that site. We built most of the applications behind it, and we manage it under a long-term contract for the state of Kansas that gets rebid every so often. So we did that for 30 or 35 states and a few federal agencies at the time I retired. And that was about 7 years ago.
Okay.
I retired in order to do other things that I was finding very interesting, like regenerative agriculture, farming, conservation work, and so forth.
Okay. I'm just going to circle back just a little bit as you described the firm and the work that you were doing, the state contracts. It reminds me of a firm I used to work for, or actually 2, electronic data systems, Ross Perot's company. because they had
PBS,
the
yes,
state Medicaid agencies. They were the
right.
fiscal agent, and that's how I got started. Now I say I'm a recovering IT business consultant. But when you were chatting about that, and I was preparing the background notes, I was thinking, probably a company doing very similar kinds of work in a way that an
Yes,
EDS would do.
the thing about our business model was we were not paid by the state. We were paid by user fees on the state websites. And
Okay.
because of the user fees, we were able to, it generated enough money that we could also build a lot of things for free. So many of the commercial applications had a fee. Many of the personal, individual person type applications that we built did not have a fee.
Okay.
And then in 1999, we went public. So that was a lot of fun, but also a lot of work.
Sure. I can imagine. Now, you mentioned a couple of years ago, you said goodbye to that life. And I suspect once growing up a farmer on a farm, once a farmer, always a farmer. How did you decide to go back into farm life and the subject of regenerative agriculture? How did that start to come into the forefront of your thoughts and what you wanted to do next?
Well, I used to say I had a lot of hobbies, and then I bought a farm,
Ah,
and that pretty much wiped all of them out except for the farm. No, I had sworn that I didn't like farming. I was never going back. I was also going to move away from Kansas City, which I did briefly, and then here I am back in this area. But yeah, I got back into farming through hunting,
ah,
and I had a couple of co-founders with me. There were four of us total, and we each brought something different to the company. So we were a pretty good team altogether, but a couple of them were pretty avid hunters. And I had hunted small game when I was growing up. They didn't have deer back then in Kansas. And so you couldn't really hunt deer, and there weren't any birds to speak of around where I lived. So I didn't do much bird hunting, but I was away from it for about 30 years. And then my co-founders, in two of them, invited me to go hunting with them. I thought it was fun, so I started doing more of it. But they used to take me sometimes to a place south of Kansas City that was mowed like a park. And I just thought this was the strangest place to have animals that you could imagine, because there didn't seem to be any decent habitat. And the guy who owned it didn't seem to be very interested in habitat. So at the time, I was newly married and actually looking for something to do on the weekends. And so my kids were all grown. So I bought a farm, and
ah,
it was not a very big place. And then one thing led to another. And over the next 10 years, I acquired more acres. And my brother, one of my brothers, I have four brothers, he had stayed and run our family farm. And he'd become more ecologically minded, and he got involved in some programs, conferences and things that were teaching a different style of agriculture, mostly around grazing. So I went to one of those, and that led me to a conference about crops and different cropping systems than what I had grown up with. And this seemed to just make a lot of sense to me. So the deeper I got into it, the more interesting it became. And one thing led to another. And so I told him, the farmer who was farming my land, we're going to do this. And then he was angry to begin with and worried. And then he got on the internet and started researching the type of agriculture I was talking about. Then he got intrigued and curious. And so we did it, and he grumbled for a couple of years, but now he's an advocate. He loves it. It's working for him. He agrees with it because we're working with nature instead of against nature. So that's turned out really well. He's sometimes not as aggressive as I would like him to be, but on the other hand, my livelihood is not tied up with that, and his is.
sure.
So I have some additional land closer to where my father's father is from, and my father, where he grew up. That's about 30 miles away from the rest of my land, and I acquired that. I was looking for someone to. I made the same deal to the farmer or offered the same deal to the farmer who was farming that land as I had to the young guy at my East farm, which was I would send him to conferences and I would buy him books and videos. If he would farm my land in this way, he decided he wasn't interested. I thanked him for what he'd done in the past and we parted ways. And I set about looking for a new farmer. And it took me 3 years. In the meantime, with no crops in the ground, I put my crop ground back to grass simply because that would be a constructive use of it. Native grasses,
Sure.
native warm teaching grasses for this area. So finally I found a fellow. We're still in the experimental stage, I think, or trying to see whether he can, whether he was the starting farmer. So he's not sure whether his long-term career is in farming, and I'm not sure whether his relationship is going to be long-term with me, but
Okay.
he's open to new ideas. And I find that very refreshing. So
Okay.
having taken 3 years, that's what led me to decide that we should have a matching service for farmers who wanted to farm regeneratively and landowners who wanted regenerative farmers.
Okay. Now, I'd like to circle back again just to kind of unpack a couple points that you had made. The initial farm, and this particular farmer, he was grumbling, but he kind of came on board.
Right,
The next piece of land that you purchased out near your father's and
right,
grandfather's, that farmer, when approached with this idea and this way of farming, said no.
right.
Why would one farmer be okay? He was grumbling, but he came on board. The other one saying no. I'm curious why. Why would they do that? Why would one be on board and the other one not?
That's a question that I think about probably more than any other question in a broader context, because the question is, why doesn't every farmer adopt these new practices? I mean, that's a way to reframe what you just said, I think. And I don't have a good answer to that. I think the first farmer that I was dealing with was a young fellow, and he was open to these new ideas. And he was worried that I would mess up his cropping system so that it wouldn't make any money for him. But after a while, he discovered that it actually could make more money for him. So he came on board. And there's and if you go cold turkey like we did and stop using chemical inputs, there's like a 3-year dip in your revenue. It's not a V, it's more like a shallow dish,
Mhm.
but it dips. And this scares some farmers away. Your land has to rebuild the soil biology that's
Mm,
under the surface. And it takes a while to do that. And while you're doing that, your crops will produce, but not as well. So he was willing to stick with me. And of course, I afforded the conferences and the CDs and so forth, or DVDs and so forth. So he was able to educate himself pretty well on it and gain some confidence from other people that were doing it. And he has a couple of those on speed dial now, and he uses them as mentors on a regular basis, right? They're like him, they are making their livelihood from farming. The guy in the West, I think he was more successful as a conventional or industrial farmer.
mm,
And so he decided he was also older. He was just a little younger than me. So I think he decided he was too old a dog to learn this new trick, or
right.
he was happy with what he was doing and didn't want to make the change, didn't want to put the effort in, something like that. So I mean, the $64,000 question for regenerative agriculture is, how do you get everybody to do it? In business school, they have a bell-shaped curve of adoption, and they say there are the pioneers, then there are the early adopters, then there's the mainstream, and then there are the late adopters, and then there are the resistors, right? Well, in regenerative agriculture, we're somewhere between pioneers and early adopters. We haven't
Mm,
even made it to mainstream yet. Regenerative agriculture is having a moment now. There's a lot of publicity about it, which I'm glad to see. I was not the first to do it, but I've been doing it for about a dozen years now. And so I'm glad that everybody else is noticing it and paying attention to it. But boy, how to win over those other folks is a real mystery. so far. They say this is the way we've always farmed. That's not true, meaning conventional or industrial farming. That's not true because this type of farming only started happening around World War II. So before that, their great grandfathers and great great grandfathers, as mine did, farmed in a way that is much closer to what we're talking about doing, where it's regenerative agriculture today. They didn't have chemical inputs to use, so they didn't use them. They put on some fertilizer, but mostly it was manure, and it was manure out of their own ranching operations or farming operations. Of course, back then there were lots of draft horses. Tractors don't make much manure, but when they did have horses, draft horses, they had a much readier source of manure than they have today.
Okay.
So figuring out how to get everybody to do this is going to be an interesting question. But the evidence is starting to roll in. The early phase was some, I won't call them reckless, some bold pioneers. They figured out how to do this. And actually, at one of the conferences I attend every year, the No-Till on the Plains conference, it started out as just no-till, but regenerative agriculture has about 5 steps. No-till is step 1. So they've kept the name, but it's actually covering all the steps now. I used to joke to my friends who were not farmers, who were not in agriculture, that every speaker I listened to had the same story, which was, I was farming conventionally. I nearly lost the farm. I ran out of money. The bank almost foreclosed. And then I discovered regenerative agriculture, and I figured out how to make a lot of money. So in a sense, that turns out to be a reality because I'm aware of a study that Kansas State University is doing to study outcomes for regenerative farmers versus conventional farmers. And I've heard one of the professors doing the study remark that conventional farming is sort of like an addiction. And with an addiction, you need to have a crisis event before you're ready to make the radical change that you need to in order to kick your addiction. Mm-hmm. So maybe what I was hearing at this conference was the crisis events that caused these people to shift over. But first we had these people that just had anecdotes. They would say, I'm doing it. I'm not a scientist. I don't have data, but I know that it works. And then you got more people doing it. Now you're getting studies, studies and laboratory results from people with hard data. So you're beginning to see that soil organic matter goes up significantly, that the nutrient value of the food that's raised on the land, they're coming at it from several directions. One is what happens in the soil when you're doing this. One is what happens to the crop. In other words, the food value that you get out of the crop, that's turning out to be higher in all of the important measurements than industrial farmed food. Another is physical well-being and mental well-being of farmers and economic well-being of farmers. Well, if you're in a commodity system, you're always just about break even. I mean, the system is pretty much designed that way. You're always going to be right around break even, trying to stay on the positive side. But if you can eliminate herbicide, fungicide, and insecticide, and most of your fertilizer and trips across the field and diesel, maintenance on your equipment, now you've avoided spending a bunch of money.
Sure.
And you still got the same commodity price. So now you've got a margin that you can call profit.
Gotcha.
And it makes you more resilient as a farmer. It makes you someone who can survive farming in today's environment. And coincidentally, and I don't mean to go on too long,
okay.
but
That's okay.
Coincidentally, your land becomes more resilient because as your soil organic matter builds up, it becomes more like a sponge. So when you have these increasingly common multiple inch rain events that we have these days, the soil can absorb that water instead of having it run off. Also, the soil has aggregates. It has structure in it so that it's not just like picking up sand at the beach and doing this and seeing it run through your fingers.
Right.
It's more like cottage cheese. So the roots and the other aggregates in the soil hold the soil there so it doesn't depart with the wind or the water.
Okay.
And so you do those things. And then when along comes a drought, well, there's stored water in the soil.
Right.
And as a result of that, you're more resilient to drought. So you're more resilient to flood, you're more resilient to erosion, you're more resilient to drought, and you're making essentially the same or better income from your farm.
Sure.
So it's something I'm very excited about. You may be able to tell that.
I can tell you have kind of lit up, so I like that. I like that. Now I've got two questions, or actually
Sure.
one obvious statement. What you've just described, creating a regenerative environment for the land, and all the
Yep.
pluses that you just shared. I think there's another plus that is, to me, is obvious, is the water. Is our waterways are now cleaner because
Right.
runoff is not going into those waterways. It's not affecting the habitat as well.
You're absolutely right. I serve on another volunteer board. It's called the Regional Advisory Council for the Kansas River. We meet to help the Kansas Water Office solve problems and implement solutions for the Kansas River. One of the biggest problems that we have is we have 4 federal reservoirs along the Kansas River waterway, and they are filling with silt. And as they fill with silt, they hold less water.
Right.
And if they hold less water, there's less available to mitigate floods. They were built for flood control in the first place. There's less water available in the event of a drought. It's just a bad situation all the way around. That silt comes from erosion. The erosion comes from the lack of soil structure upstream in the crop fields where they've been practicing this type of agriculture. So at the same time, they're experimenting with very expensive solutions to try to get some of this silt out of the reservoirs. They're also very concerned about steps that we could take, including regenerative agriculture upstream, to try to keep the problem from getting worse, right? If you've got a hole in your boat, it's one thing to be bailing. It's another thing, plug the holes so
Plug
that you
the
can
hole.
make some progress against the water in
Sure.
your boat,
Sure.
right?
So I've got a question, and I think we're far along into the conversation about regenerative agriculture, but I think it's worthwhile to go back. What is defined by regenerative agriculture? Why is it different than the traditional methods of farming? Because I think some listeners are going to ask, well, tell me more. I need to know the
Yeah,
system in place, and why is that the case?
right. So regenerative agriculture has different people may describe it different ways, but in general, it has certain things in common. And you may have heard the term sustainable agriculture.
Hmm.
Sustainable meaning something that we can do for a long time that won't run our system down to the point where we can't live with it anymore. That's a good term, but people coined the term regenerative agriculture to describe a system that doesn't only sustain where we are, but actually rebuilds where we were before we started doing this type of industrial agriculture. So in general, people that are doing there are 2 types, I would say, primarily in cropping systems. There's the pasture side of it that I'll be glad to talk about too, but there's the crop side of it. So far, I've mostly been talking about the crop side of it. So there are 6 steps. The first step is don't till the ground, because as the soil biology establishes itself, it creates pathways between plants and to the minerals. Mostly these are fungal pathways. And if you till the ground, what you're doing is it's like carpet bombing all of the roads and bridges in a city. You're not going to be able to get around. You're going to have to rebuild all that. It's going to take a lot of energy and a lot of time and money. So if you're tilling the soil, you're destroying the structure that's there, not only the infrastructure, but also those aggregates I was talking about. So the first thing you do is you only open a slit to put a seed in and close it up, and that's it. The Native Americans even went one step further. They used a stick to make a hole instead of a blade to make a slit,
Hmm.
but they would put the seeds in and that was it. The second step is try to keep a, a carpet, like a mulch layer, so to speak, on your soil all the time. And the reason for that is it helps preserve moisture. It helps keep the soil cooler in the summer, warmer in the winter, and it provides organic matter for some of the biology, like the earthworms. They come up to the surface, grab things, and pull them back down into the ground. So you want this mulch layer as much as you can over the surface. The other thing it does, annual weeds, most of the weeds that you hear about farmers fighting, are annual weeds. They are, and it's a big battle between pesticides, new pesticides, persistent weeds, problems. Glyphosate or Roundup has been something that was a miracle for about 20 years, and now the plants have developed resistance to it, so it's
Right.
not a miracle anymore. So you have to come up with others. Well, these annual weeds have a space in nature. They have a niche, and their niche is to colonize bare ground. So if you have rows of corn with nothing but bare ground in between, they're doing their darndest to do their job.
Right.
And here come people that are trying to poison them. And so they evolve. They evolve quickly, to enable them to do their job despite this poison that's being thrown at them. Well, it turns out if you have a mulch layer, just like in your garden, fewer of those weeds sprout because the seeds don't recognize the ground as bare,
Right.
with a mat on top of it. And so you have fewer weed problems. And so you need less herbicide. And so it's a win-win all the way around on that. So second thing is keep a mulch layer. Third is keep a living root in the soil all the time. Now, it turns out that plants photosynthesize. What do they do when they photosynthesize? They make sugar. They make carbohydrates. That's what photosynthesis is. It turns out that only about half those carbohydrates are used to feed the plant itself for all of its growth and so forth. The other half, they exude through the roots to feed the fungus and bacteria that are in the soil. And why would they do that? It's a barter economy down there.
Right.
Under the ground. They are trading those carbohydrates for the water and the minerals that the fungus brings back to them and that the bacteria create for them. And those bacteria can't photosynthesize, fungus can't photosynthesize, so they need those carbohydrates, and the plant needs those minerals. Fungus have an amazing ability to generate enzymes, and enzymes that will dissolve solid rock.
I would imagine it's also, again, I'm kind of I'm shooting a little bit blank here, blue sky, but it seems from what I know about bacteria and fungus, because I do a lot of probiotic eating.
Okay, great.
Is they're also providing a protection, I would imagine, for
Oh,
the
yes.
for the roots themselves.
Yes. I was just describing their main job, not all of their job. You're
Right.
absolutely right.
Okay.
It's a very
I
dynamic,
got it. Whew.
very, there's a lot going on down there. And
Oh, yeah.
we are only now just beginning to unravel some of those things. And when I say we, I'm not talking about me because I'm not a soil scientist. I just
Right.
read about these things.
Right.
But those guys have been turned on to the amazing things that are happening under the soil, and they're doing more and more research.
Right.
So for instance, there's lots of phosphate in the soil. Well, if you do a soil test, agriculture extension, maybe the only thing they will measure for phosphate is available free phosphate. Well, phosphate's very reactive, so it's hardly ever available and free. It's always locked up. Aluminum phosphate, magnesium phosphate, iron phosphate. Well, funguses can break those chemical bonds and bring that phosphate back to the plant. And so they bring the available free phosphate back after they make it. So it's just really cool. But you need a living root in the soil to keep feeding them, because once your cash crop, your crop you're raising for cash dies, gets old and is ready to harvest, that fungus will only last about a week. And then it dies itself. It creates spores and things. And so next time you have a crop there, you have to wait for the fungus to break out of its spore and try to recreate all this infrastructure again. If you can keep a cover crop, and that's why they call it a cover crop, it covers the bare ground. and it's in between your cash crop and your next cash crop, your cover crop. If you can keep a cover crop growing, you're feeding the soil biology. So your soil will be better when you plant the next cash crop than it was when you harvested the last cash crop. And that when you terminate that cover crop, which you can do either with a one-time application of herbicide or by rolling it, if it's at the right stage of growth, you can have a big roller that essentially breaks the stem and kills it. Now you've got that mulch layer that you need, and you can plant right through it, plant right through the mulch with your next cash crop. So that's that. Diversity is good. This is the 4-step. Diversity is good. More diversity is better. Nature never has a monoculture, ever. Not in soil biology, not in plants, not in animals, not in people. Never a monoculture. And so the more diversity you have, it turns out that what we call weeds, which I guess is called forbs, different ones of them go to different depths and can be used to break open hard soil down below. Also, they have different jobs when it comes to this one is really good. For instance, dandelions are really good at pulling calcium out of the soil. So you'll see cattle and sheep. Today, they really like the dandelions. Tomorrow, they really like the ragweed. Well, those are pulling different minerals, and their bodies are telling them that they need different things. So they will select from day to day based upon what they need that day, what their bodies tell them they need. And each of these weeds or forbs have a unique job to do. Together, they make a community. And that's why diversity is so important. 5th point is livestock are good. If you can graze that cover crop, livestock and grazing forage evolve together. And there are bacteria in the rumen that come out in the manure that will actually inoculate the soil with beneficial bacteria and just feed that cycle. So the grazers are helping the grazed plants, and the grazed plants are helping the grazers. And the 6th rule is simply context. Where I am, I get 44 inches of rain a year, recently more like 50 or 60. And I have a friend who's doing this type of agriculture down just below the panhandle of Oklahoma, and he gets 16 inches a year, recently more like 10 or 11. And so his context, the rules are the same. The context or the application is different. My context, very different from his. So those are the 6 rules on the crop side. On the livestock side, it turns out that herds used to graze around, and they would stay fairly tightly together. They liked each other. They groomed each other and so forth. And if you look at cattle just turned out in a pasture, they pick and choose what they would like to eat, not only based on what they need that day, but, oh, I like this plant, but I don't like this plant. If you crowd them together, not inhumanely, but just keep them crowded together and give them new forage each day, what you can do is change their grazing behavior. And they will actually, instead of picking and choosing, and when they pick and choose, they're selecting against, ecologically or environmentally selecting against the good plants and selecting in favor of the bad plants because they're not eating the bad plants, right? So they get to grow. Meanwhile, the good plants get eaten down, right? So if they mow, then they're pretty much taking everything at the same time. And then tomorrow they get some new graze. And then the next day they get some new graze. And so crowding together in a beneficial way, new graze, so frequent movements. The 3rd critical step is long rest. I just got back in March from visiting a fellow in about 90 minutes, 4 hours drive. But it's up and over from Chihuahua, Mexico. And he and a group of ranchers in his neighborhood have been able to use these grazing principles and nothing else. No chemicals, no special anything. They have fences, they have water, and they have grazing animals, and that is it. They have been able to bring grass back to the desert. by doing this. And in some cases, he will graze a paddock, which is what you call the temporary enclosures that they make to graze. His paddocks average about 100 acres. He has maybe 500 or 600 cattle. He will, depending upon the quality of the grass in there, whether it's good or bad, he will leave them in there as little time as 2 hours. And then he will rest that ground for a year before he's back to graze it again. But when you graze grass and you don't overgraze it, what you do is stimulate its growth. And it's this symbiosis that's developed between grazing and grazing animals. And he's been doing this now for about 15 years, to the point where his grass has come back to such an extent that it is changing the pH of the soil and killing mesquite. The mesquite that overrun his neighbors' properties that are not using this method.
Right.
His neighbors have sand and mesquite. He has grass and fewer mesquite. It was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. And if he can do that on 10 inches a year, there's no reason virtually any place in the world couldn't do that.
Sure. I'm curious, again, I'm going to be, this is a little stretch, but it seems too that in the grazing, this is much more humane grazing. It's not factory farm kind of
Right.
grazing. And I would
Absolutely
imagine,
true.
and the animals, when they are harvested for wherever, if it's whether it's for milk or meat, those are going to be much healthier products than if I were to purchase product from a factory farm. So you've got two kinds of benefits there. You've got the crop benefit, and you also have the grazing benefit as well. That's pretty amazing.
Sure. You're absolutely right. And as a matter of fact, people are beginning, the guys that do this on a regular basis will swear that, for instance, if they have an animal that has a bunch of flies on it, they know that animal's sick. The other animals don't have flies on it. The flies are there. They're essentially telling the animal owner that animal has a problem. And that animal will probably get culled out of the herd and possibly sent to market because you don't want those genetics in your herd, those kinds of things. At this no-till conference I attended, there was a fellow who is a PhD entomologist from the University of Florida. And he was saying that he could predict which insects would attack your crop based upon the sugar level, called the Brix level, in the leaves of your growing crop. He said if it's above 12, Brix reading of 12, they don't attack it. He says, I've seen a grasshopper land on a plant, take a bite, and fly off after one bite because the Brix level was above 12. He says and let me see if I can get this right, between 10 and 12, it'll be grasshoppers. Between 8 and 10, it'll be other chewing insects. Between 6 and 8, it'll be aphids. And below 6, it'll be other sucking insects. And so he's pretty confident that he can do this based upon the facts. So he says, if you're getting an aphid infestation, what that tells you is, number one, if you've got pollinator strips around your field, the beneficial insects are going to come in and wipe out the aphids. But number two, what it's telling you is that your plants have a deficiency of some type. And if you pay attention to what the plants are telling you, then you can address the deficiency in some way. Sir Alfred Howard is a famous guy who wrote a treatise about this based on his field work in India and I think it was Barbados and England, India, Barbados, and England, between about 1906 and 1938. And he said, you should thank the diseases for attacking your crops, because what they're really telling you is what needs to happen, what is wrong and needs to be corrected. But you're absolutely right. The produce from these farms, whether it's milk or meat or grains or fruits or nuts, will be higher in food value. There's an organization in Massachusetts called the Bionutrient Food Association that is attempting to build a spectrometer you could take to the grocery store, and you could scan your fruit or your vegetables.
I love it.
What they're hoping, I mean, they have the same goal in mind that I do, which is to improve the health of everybody and by promoting these methods. But what they're hoping is everybody will select in favor of the higher Brix values or the higher spectroscopic readings, right? And that will drive the market demand in that area in addition to making people healthier.
I love it. I
So
love it. So I'm curious, we're going to start to kind of wrap up our conversation today, Brad, but how'd you get to the Outdoor Writers Association's conference in Casper?
sure, I'm do a lot of work with the Nature Conservancy, but I also do a lot of work with Pheasants Forever and Quail
Okay.
Forever.
Okay.
I've had a long-standing relationship with them. All of my land has a conservation easement on it in their favor.
Right.
And so um, they asked me to write an editorial supporting an act in Congress, which would be modeled on the Wetlands Restoration Act, only it would be for prairies. I'm in a prairie state. Prairies are the most endangered ecology in the world, even more than the Amazon rainforest. And so I did that. Then a few months later, they called and said the outdoor writers were going to be having their annual conference. Would I come and talk about the experience on my farm? One of the things we haven't talked about is the first piece of land I bought had acid mine drainage on it because it had been strip mined. And I didn't know it at the time through my own. I made a few calls and they assured me it was okay. And that was not the right thing. But
Right.
I've been rebuilding that land to the best I can based upon what I've learned about acid mine drainage. So that's how I ended up out there on the panel talking about regenerative agriculture, because it's my conviction that we don't have to poison ourselves in order to feed ourselves.
Sure.
If we do, then we're really in trouble, but we don't have to. And furthermore, my license plate says EFIAH. Since everybody was asking me about it, I actually had a decal made and I put it in the back window that explains that. It says every field is a habitat,
Right.
because I don't think we also should have to choose between wildlife habitat and crop systems or pasture. I think they should be working together. You
Sure.
should be able to have both at the same time.
Sure. Sure.
And so that's my goal with my farm, is to reconcile agriculture with wildlife habitat.
I love it. I love it. And again, I thought the panel discussion was very interesting, and I truly appreciated your contribution. And as they say, here we are. I love it. I love it. Before we kind of head out today, Brad, as you kind of look back on your career, what you've accomplished, I mean, you've got a lot of hats, a lot of rodeos, so to speak. And we have a segment, we call it the aha moment, where we ask our guests to kind of look back and look at the impact that they've made or that has occurred because of the work that they're doing. What would be your aha moment?
Whoa. Well, working backwards, there's the one where it took me 3 years to find a farmer. And therefore I said, maybe there's a space for this application, online application. By the way, if you go to farmtender.us, you can sign up and we will email you as soon as it launches, which I'm hoping will be in about another 30 to 45 days.
I love
But
it. Yes.
there was that one. When I bought this farm and I wanted to learn more about wildlife habitat, which was my main focus at the beginning, not agriculture, because remember, I was done with agriculture.
Right.
I ended up going to grass camp, we call it. And then from grass camp, I went to no-till on the plains, and it's like the scales fell from my eyes. I said, I didn't know you could do this with land. I didn't know you could be happy, because the thing I noticed about these farmers have one of the highest suicide rates
Sure.
in the population.
Yeah.
Well, those are conventional farmers. The farmers that I know that are doing regenerative agriculture are happy.
Yeah.
And it took me years to figure out why that was. I think it was very obvious. They're working with nature, not against nature. They don't go out every day to fight nature and fight the weeds and fight the pests and so many things that they do with good intentions end up backfiring. And now you got a worse problem. If you spray the aphids, you kill off all the beneficial insects that were going to eat the aphids. So now the aphids have a free run than if they hadn't been sprayed.
Right.
So it's that happiness. I mean, it ought to be possible to be happy, have food, and have wildlife and not have to fight so hard. And I would say that was it. Of course, with my business, it was when I figured out that's why it took 6 years, because we were approaching the state agencies in Kansas and we'd say, here's this idea we have. Would you like to do it? And they had about 12 questions. They were always, no matter which agency it was, they were always the same questions, but they'd say, well, we don't do this because of this reason. And would say, oh, well, we think we'll do it this way. How would that be? And they say, okay, that's fine. But, and then they'd have another question and you'd solve that one. And they say, but, and you have another question. And finally, they'd reach a question that you couldn't answer. And you'd say, can I get back to you? You get back to them. Well, once I got all those answers to all those questions, pieces started falling in place.
Right.
And this took off, and the agents, it's like a tripod. I used to call it a 3-legged milking stool. Each of the parties had to give up something in order to get something.
Right.
The private individuals had to pay a fee in order to get this faster, more efficient, more accurate information they were getting from the state. And the state had to give up some control in order to get the benefits of this technology. And then the private company, of which I was later a part, had to give up its ability to, it had to submit to the state's management because it was under essentially a monopoly contract for
Right.
a fixed period of time. So once that all fit together, that was the aha for my business. So with each of the things I've done, I've had an aha moment. And
That's good.
all
That's
I can
good.
say is I've had some downtimes. Sometimes some things haven't worked very well, but for the most part, I've had a hell of a ride and I've really
Yeah.
enjoyed it.
And you're gonna be diving in the whole plate head first. That's good.
Well, I just wake up every day and try to figure out how to advance something that I think will help. And help us as a world, help us. Nobody can look at me and say, I don't like to eat. So
There you
help
go.
me keep my food supply going, help my wildlife survive.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Any final thoughts that you would like to share with our listeners before we head out today? A quote. I know we've got an article we're going to share about about what the grasslands
Right.
from the Kansas reflector. What was it? Grasslands abandoning meat may spell disaster for vital ecosystems. We'll provide backlinks to an article like that. But any final thoughts that you'd like to leave with our listeners before we leave?
Just the fact that I think we could have it all. But we have to be smart about it. We have the intelligence, and we are working on the technology that will solve our problems if we are willing to have the political will to make the changes.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Before we do head out, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, I know we've mentioned it, but let's mention it again. Where's the best place for them to learn more about you and your work?
Probably FarmTender.us, www.farmtender.us.
Fantastic. And I know as a former business guy, you probably have a LinkedIn profile.
I do.
And
William Bradley.
yeah, and we'll provide a backlink to that as well. Brad, it's been a pleasure. I'm so glad that you are open to being on this podcast. I know you've enjoyed yourself because you lit up a couple times. So I know you're into this. This is a great topic. And I mean, I came away today from learning something new, and I do look forward to continuing to learn more about you and your work and perhaps staying in touch. And oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, I am an opportunistic podcaster. I always like to put photographs on my website on outdooradventureseries.com. If there are some photographs of you in your outdoors, farm, fields, hunting element, I would love 2 or 3, 4 photographs that we can include as a collage along. We're going to need your headshot for our banners, but having a couple photos, I would appreciate if you would share that with us.
Usually I'm the one taking the photos, but I'll see if I can find some of me in my element. I'll tell you, I came to really enjoy hunting, and I support hunting, responsible hunting. But the rush you get when you've had a good hunt, I get that same rush now from the season to season activity of my crop fields, my pastures, and my timber. When I'm doing something that makes a big difference and I can see it pay off, it's as good as shooting that 12-point buck.
That's one heck of a rush, and I prefer my shooting with 100 to 400 millimeter lens, but you got to have that rush. You got to have it.
Yep. Yep.
Brad, thank you so much for joining us again today. I appreciate it. Again, you taking the time, and I've learned a lot. I know our listeners will have learned a lot. Look forward to staying in touch with you. Okay.
Thanks very much for having me.
All right.
I've enjoyed it.
Fantastic. Stay on the line. We're going to do a quick close, and then you and I can have a final chat. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay, folks. So this is a little different kind of episode for the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. And so glad we had Brad Bradley on the show today. Again, I met him at the Outdoor Writers Association of America's conference this year in Casper. He was part of the panel. And a lot of talk around conservation, ecology, and his topic about regenerative agriculture and how farmers and the hunters, can coexist together. And this topic and talking about his work and his passion, I just thought it was very interesting. And for me, this is a perfect fit because we are talking about wildlife conservation. We're talking about ecosystem conservation, and we're talking about farming and agriculture and really doing it in a way that is sustainable over the long haul rather than using the land for what we want, we need in the moment, and not thinking about the system that needs to be in place so that the land is available for not only my generation, the generations that follow me, but the generations that follow them, and so on and so forth. So hope you enjoyed today's episode with Brad. We are on the outdooradventureseries.com. So if you enjoy the episode, leave us a comment, share the episode. You can also find us on our LinkedIn and Facebook pages, the Outdoor Adventure Series, and the YouTube will also be available. You can like us and comment on us there. When you see the big red button, it says subscribe on our Outdoor Adventure Series YouTube page. You can then get notified whenever we publish a new podcast episode. And of course, we are on all of the podcast directories. So wherever you listen to your podcast, just do a search for Outdoor Adventure Series and you can subscribe there as well. So anytime we publish a new episode, you're going to find us. Okay. All right, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day, and we will see you on a future episode of the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. Take care now.